This
And
conference will
thanks.
now be recorded.
Cool. Thank you very much. And thank you, Yanis, for inviting me to speak today. So I'm going to talk to you all, thanks for joining, about experiment-driven product development. So by way of a little bit of context, I should probably start by exposing some myths of product development that I've learned so far. So firstly, how do you know if you're building the right thing? To be honest, you very rarely know if you're building the right thing until later, or at least until something is released. Secondly, how do you avoid making the wrong decisions? It's almost impossible to completely avoid making wrong decisions. So in some ways we have to accept this and try making this reduce the number of wrong decisions we make instead. So the bigger question, therefore, is how do you minimize the time and the effort spent on the wrong things? And I would like to use this opportunity to propose that experiment-driven product development, or XDPD for short, is one way of achieving that. So what is experiment-driven product development? I would describe it as an evolution of agile lean product development. It's not necessarily in opposition to kind of agile ways of working or lean UX. It's more of an evolution of those practices, an iterative design. But importantly, it places the emphasis on questions rather than solutions. So a typical way of approaching kind of iterative development, particularly from the kind of lean UX side of things, has been that you spend the first kind of part of your time after you've done your initial research coming up with ideas of solutions, and then those become your hypotheses, and you seek to validate those solutions. What I'm proposing with experiment-driven product development is that you take a step back and you concentrate more on the questions that lead to those solutions rather than leaping straight into validating solutions. And obviously I'll explain a bit more as I go along about what the implications of that is. So this is the kind of basic process of experiment-driven product development. It's probably familiar to most of you if you've ever kind of run any form of experimentation, really, but with a few slight tweaks perhaps. So the first step of kind of uncovering your premises and assumptions. Secondly, kind of asking and answering questions. As I've said, the real cornerstone of this approach is concentrating on the questions. You find that your backlog ends up being made of, it's a backlog of questions that you want to answer and get answers to. Where appropriate, you'll formulate a hypothesis. Now, not every experiment needs a hypothesis, as I'll talk about both here and in the book, but that's a stage that you go through for some kinds of questions. Importantly, it's only kind of once you've designed the experiment that you then select a method of how you're going to answer the question. So often you find people kind of starting with, okay, we're going to run a workshop, or we're going to run an A/B test, or we're going to do some user research. And sometimes that can be to the detriment of actually giving yourself an answer that will actually be helpful for you. So one of the kind of key points here is to kind of design the experiment first, and towards the end of that, selecting the most appropriate method to help answer the question. Obviously then running an experiment, taking the time to analyze the results, revealing the answer, and making a decision. So where possible, all the experiments that you run shouldn't just be kind of answering any question that you've ever wanted to ask, but they should all be formulated around helping you make a business decision, really. So what do I mean by an experiment? There's a couple of kind of misconceptions here, and then I'll talk about how I define an experiment. So the most common kind of conception of an experiment is that it's an A/B test. This is obviously well founded, in the scientific practice, scientific world. Experiment basically does mean a control and a variant, and you test between the two. The way I'd like to reframe this is that an experiment is much more about a question. Whether you answer that question, as I say, through an A/B test, or you could answer it through a piece of kind of qualitative research, a survey, it doesn't really matter. The method is whatever method is correct for helping you answer the question. So yeah, that's the first kind of preconception to change your thinking there. The second one is that experiments are not just for R&D innovation teams. So when I first started working in this way, we were very much in a siloed team doing all the fun innovation stuff, which does give you a fair amount of freedom, but it also, for one, makes the other teams jealous. Why are they the ones that get to have all the fun? But also, you kind of get stuck in that mode of, well, they just do the crazy experiments. They're allowed to do anything they want. And really, experiments should be a core way of how you develop a product, how you answer the questions that help you make decisions. So it's not just a case of hiving this off to an innovation team. You might start with a kind of best practice team and help then coach other teams. But yeah, it's more of a kind of approach to product development than let's create an innovation team. So I would say experiments are really just a structured way of asking questions. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. I mean, 2 years ago when I first started working in this way, yes, all of our experiments were A/B tests, but as we started thinking more about this, breaking it down into what would actually help us, this is what we came to realize, that really an experiment is just a framework for posing a question, working out how best to answer it, and answering it and analyzing it. So when you think of an experiment as a structured way to ask questions, it becomes a much more flexible tool and a different way of approaching product development. And it boils down to these kinds of questions. So what are we trying to discover? What are we trying to learn? What are we trying to find out? Why is it important for us to find this out? So being really clear on the importance of answering this question. As I've talked about, what are we going to do? So what is the method that will help us answer the question? If it is something where we have a hypothesis, then really being very precise about that. So what change or difference might we expect to see as a result of what we do? How are we going to measure it? And in terms of the scale that we need in order to get a reliable answer, how precise do we need the result to be? And how much of this is and how certain do we need it to be? And this will depend on the context. Is this a life and death decision for your business? Or is it just something which, should the color be blue or red and it doesn't really matter, but it could help raise sales or things like that. It's worth saying that this isn't necessarily easy to go straight into, and it kind of breaks away from a lot of the traditional product management type of things. Product management, all about detailed roadmaps and, how do you get guaranteed successes and making sure there's no wasted effort. This won't necessarily give you any of that stuff, but it will still be, important and good. So why, if it doesn't give you any of those three things, why do I think people should use this approach? So firstly, it focuses you on the results. So it gets you out of thinking about specific deliverables or specific solutions. And it's much more important to focus on what does the evidence say, be that data, be that kind of survey qualitative evidence. It focuses you on the actual answers to those questions. Secondly, again, it kind of helps you stop fixating over pet solutions. It's very, very easy for both the team and other stakeholders to come up with a solution and kind of get too attached to it. Now, the emotion is completely natural. We all want to help. We all want to be the one to solve the question. but really getting you focused on that question and finding an answer rather than I've come up with a solution, I want to validate that it's necessarily correct or not. It allows you to listen to your users at scale. Scale is really important because that helps you form a reliable answer, an answer you can trust to make a decision. And it allows you to treat, we came up with this phrase, it allows you to treat data as a stakeholder. So not kind of personal data necessarily, but more user activity data. So, we talk, the team are obviously a stakeholder, the people you're reporting into or your other colleagues in the business are stakeholders in your product, but actually using the user activity data as a proxy for your users allows them, to express how they behave with your product, gives them an equal stake in the product direction itself. It forces you to challenge your assumptions. So a key kind of early part of this approach is to get down on post-its in writing any of the assumptions you have, any of the assumed knowledge, the industry knowledge, the pet theories you might have, and challenge those. It's not about being right, it's about trying to find out which of those are wrong as quickly as possible so you stop wasting your time on them. And in doing so, you reduce the cost of failure. So, rather than spending months and months and getting attached to a particular solution, the sooner you can test something for the cheaper, as cheaply as possible in a reliable way, then you've spent less resources, less money, and okay, you failed, but you've done that in a much cheaper way, so you can iterate faster. It prioritizes evidence over opinions. So opinions are completely natural when we're working together as humans. But sometimes if all you've got is two people shouting at each other over who's right, the best thing to do is let's test it. Let's actually try and gather some evidence to see what the right answer is. So it gets you out of just who the hippo, the most important person in the room. Actually, some ideas that really important people might have are good, some are bad. It doesn't matter who's coming up with the ideas. The important thing is to answer the question and try and test these ideas or get the answers to the question. So we like to think of ourselves essentially as scientists for product development. That is to say, none of this in some ways is that new. It's just applying the scientific method to product development, but in a way which is possibly more rigorous than we have done before. We observe, we hypothesize, we experiment, we analyze, and we keep repeating to fade. Some principles of experiment-driven product development. So this isn't just something for data scientists. So again, a lot of the time when we first started experimenting, it was up to the data scientists to work out the maths, get the p-value, work out the significance and all of that. But the sooner you involve the whole team, you get the shared understanding, not only of what the question you're trying to answer is, why, to keep the team motivated, why is it important, why is it something we want to know as a team, and also to have the shared understanding of what we're actually going to do. If we're going to build something, if it is going to be an A/B test, making it crystal clear what the different conditions are going to be. Because if it's just the data scientist and the product manager, or maybe the UX person, if you're lucky, working on this and the developers are kept out of it, you're going to lead to misunderstandings and you're going to kind of invalidate the whole experiment. We like to think of ourselves as kind of data informed rather than data driven. So just because you may be relying on data and evidence doesn't necessarily mean that what it says is going to be the right thing for you to do as a business. You need, as humans, we need to take responsibility for the way we develop our products. So the data can inform what we do, but it shouldn't necessarily completely drive what we do. In the short term, it might come up with a really good solution and one which is successful for the business, but is it doing more harm than good in the long run? Something that you have to be aware of. I like, rather than talking about minimum viable product, I talk in the book about simplest useful thing, because I believe it's a more useful kind of phrase to concentrate on. I find minimum viable product quite problematic, basically because nobody can agree on what the minimum viable product is. There's so many different interpretations, whereas simplest useful thing really hones the mind on what is the simplest useful thing we can do in order to answer this question. So to dive a little bit deeper on this, from a product user point of view, simple, easy to use, useful, it fulfills a need. From the developer's point of view, what can we do with what we have available to us now? So given we have access to data and APIs, what can we build out of that? Similarly, maybe building a prototype isn't the right thing. Maybe just putting a paper prototype in front of people is enough. What is the simplest thing we could do? I've put we could build, but maybe it's just we could do in order to answer our question. And here we go, from the experiment point of view, what's the simplest method we could use in order to learn? What's the lowest cost way that would still ensure reliable evidence? So how does this look in practice? There are three main phases to experiment-driven design. The first is the planning phase. So this is when you kind of expose the raw materials, various assumptions you might have, or ideas, or knowledge gaps, things you don't know. Then you prepare the questions, prioritize them. 3, the establishing motivation. Why is it important for you to know this? Then you move into the design phase. So here I distinguish between kind of belief-led questions, where you have an idea, you have a hypothesis, and you're really kind of running the experiment to test whether that is correct or not, versus exploratory questions, where you have no prior belief necessarily. So the experiment is still an experiment because you're trying to answer a question, but it's more exploratory. So if you've got a belief, then you should take the time to formulate a hypothesis. But regardless of whether it's belief-led or exploratory, you need to decide the measures. How are you going to know whether, how are you going to decide what the actual answer is? Are there conditions? How do you decide who to involve in the experiment, population of it? How many people, how many users, how much data are you going to need in order to get a reliable answer? And once you've got all of this, then you can decide on the method of how you can get an answer. Excuse me. The final phase then is the analysis phase. So after you've run the experiment, analysing the results, making sure you've gathered enough data, enough evidence. Is it reliable? What is the answer? Uncovering the answer, and then finally, as I say, making a decision. I talk very specifically about kind of testing hypotheses and testing in experiments rather than validating ideas, because validating can sometimes lead you astray into trying to prove yourself correct rather than testing whether you are wrong. So there's just a little tweak of language there, really. Just to emphasize, as I've already kind of said, it's very important to kind of decide the scale and the conditions of the experiment before choosing a method. And the scale really comes down to how certain and how precise you need to be. No peeking. So this was a mistake that we commonly made when we were first starting out. Once you've started an experiment, particularly if it's an A/B test, don't look at the results during the time that the experiment is running. You have to stop yourself doing that. A common mistake is that people keep looking at the results of A/B tests until they've reached significance. There's a lot of writing out there on why this is a bad idea, basically because of the randomness of life. Experiments can go from significant to not significant back to significant again and keep flip-flopping between them. There are other kind of statistical methods for trying to avoid this, but as a general rule, I think the best approach really is to decide up front how much data you need to collect. Then you work out how much time you reckon it will take you to collect that data, and don't get too obsessed about finding out the answer until you've collected that data. We put together this thing called an experiment card. It can fit onto an index card and, as you can see, a slide, and it really captures kind of the important aspects of the experiment. This is both for kind of presentation back to people in showcases or product demos, but you can also have this on your planning board. If you meet for morning stand-ups, the background, this left-hand column, you can put on one side of the card, the details you can put on the other side, and just make sure that everyone has a shared understanding. If you can get everyone together, or at least your kind of discipline leads together to write this card together, then it makes sure everyone has a shared understanding of what you're going to do. So a couple of examples of how we use this. So this is from the kind of recommendations product I worked on, where the question was, if we put the sign-up card for our email service right at the front for the pop-up we were running around recommendations, would that drive more email sign-ups? It sounds kind of obvious, but we wanted to test it. It may not be right. So why? Why is it important to us? Putting a hypothesis together, making sure we decided the measures, how are we going to determine this? Also doing some health checks as well. We didn't want to ruin the long-term health of our product at the same time. What were the conditions? How long were we going to run it for? And then having the headline results at the end. Another example from changing things on the website. So here we don't know, would showing latest articles by subject rather than just 6 of the latest articles, no matter what subject, work for journal sites? We reckon it would lead to a higher click-through rate. So we measure that, we set the conditions, we work out how long we need to run it for, and it worked in this case. It did give us a higher click-through rate. So obviously, once you've run the experiment, you need to take the time to analyze. So what have you learned? What are the raw numbers? What happened to your kind of health check metrics? Is it a reliable answer? So you can use statistical techniques to determine whether you can trust the results of the experiment. What's the consequences of that? What does it mean for our hypothesis? What would we do differently? You're never going to get this right first time. So it's important to take the time of, what new questions have been posed because of this? What did you get wrong this time that you might want to change next time? And as I say, you have kind of a backlog of questions. Now you might run an experiment and that kind of invalidates a whole set of questions. So take the time again to kind of then re-look at your backlog and see how that affects the priority and the things in that backlog. So in summary, I think the important kind of parts of this are about focusing on questions, not solutions, challenging your assumptions rather than fixating on validating things, being evidence driven, not being data driven, but being data informed, involving the whole team, and then using the results to inspire new questions, new experiments as well. Another thing just to remember, I took this from last year's Mind the Product conference. Experiments don't fail, hypotheses are proven wrong. Unless you've gone horribly wrong in your experiments, it's very rare to feel shame that you've done something wrong. If the experiment has failed, if the hypothesis has been proven wrong, that's a great result. You don't have to spend any more time on that. That is obviously a very, very quick run through of experiment-driven product development. The ebook is now available via apress.com and Amazon. It's also available if you subscribe to SpringerLink, and in fact on SpringerLink, the preface and introduction is available for free. The paperback will be available in December, and yes, there is currently a discount code available until December the 3rd, and that is a whistle-stop tour through experiment-driven product development.
Thank you very much, Paul. Very impressive. You made it. Not only did you publish a book, congratulations on that, but you managed to condense it all into 25 minutes for us. Thank you very much for that.
There we go.
Let's see here at the final few minutes. Anybody has a question, feel free to post it on the chat, or you can also go on unmute and ask it. So let's see. I found a lot of good things in there, so thank you for that, Paul.
Hmm. Thank you.
I not only liked the misconceptions about experiments, but also I think you really made a good, compelling case for using the approach. I remember hearing about this in London at, I think, a
Hmm.
group meeting about a year ago, as you were probably in the middle of writing the book. And
Yes, just
it's really
starting.
good to see how it's all come together.
Hmm. Thank you.
This is Carrie. I have a question. Hi,
All right.
Paul.
Hello. Hi.
So, how when any of us start a new change our process, we do it as part of a team
Hmm.
and decide to do it. And I'm sure it took many iterations for you to get to a point where you could put it all in a book.
Hmm.
What are some of the things that you and your team learned that would help others make the transition to this way of thinking about projects?
Yeah. I think part of it is trying to not do like a clean break necessarily. It's worth kind of starting to phase between the traditional way of developing products and asking like one or two questions at first, introducing the idea of the experiment card, and then kind of building momentum that way. I think it's worth having some kind of session together as a team where you list out, post-it notes, all your assumptions, all this raw material, just to kind of get everyone into that headspace. And then maybe you pick one or two high priority things that we want to know, and go from there. I think that other things that we learned was kind of the importance of taking the time to design the experiment setup, and also the no peeking rule. I think that's something that is a common mistake by people.
All right. Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you, Carrie, for the question. Anybody else here in the final slot for a quick question, perhaps with a quick answer? I could wrap it up if nobody objects. I would say, in the spirit of not only experiment-driven product development, but also I think in the spirit of the many past peer group meetings and conferences. I hope you've received some answers, but just like Paul said, it's all about the value is in the questions. And so, if nothing else, I hope you might have left this call with some better questions, because I think there's a lot of value in that. Thank you very much, Paul, once again. I will,
Cool.
as I mentioned in the beginning, turn this into put the recording online alongside a blog post, and on the email you'll get, you'll also have the contact details for Paul, and I know he's very happy to continue the conversation.
Certainly. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Paul. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye
Bye.
bye.